I think spaces are always going to matter, right? It doesn't matter how hybrid or how remote people are. Space matters. Quality of space matters. I'm going to say that meeting other humans in person matters.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Buildings 2.0. Today I'm speaking with Corina Ocanto, Vice President, Workplace Strategy at Stream Realty Partners. Corina, thanks for chatting with me today.
Hey, yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Take us back. What sparked your passion about workplace strategy, design? How did it get
All the
started?
above. Sure. I mean, how far back do we want to go? I wanted
We
to
got
be an
time.
artist when I was little,
Okay.
but that was not enough of a career for the family. So I got to study architecture instead. Did
Yeah.
that, got my undergrad and my master's in architecture. Always loved design and the design process, especially like design thinking, problem solving. I was never a designer who like had these like brilliant, beautiful ideas. I was like, what's the problem? What are we solving? Who's the person using it? I like those types of questions. So I realized I didn't actually want to build buildings because I'm awful with like details and materials and stuff. Like, I'm not your guy. So I got an opportunity to do research around the workplace and the future of work in the city and how people move around. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting. What if I worked with corporate space, which is not what I thought I was going to be doing? And then worked with Gensler, who is the biggest firm doing that kind of work for many years, and got to be a designer and construction admin and all the roles for interior workplace projects. And then I got a chance to work with a client who hired us to do their design and then also implement the change that was going to be captured in that design with a change management project. And that was like my first foray into consulting. And after that project, I was like, this is what I want to do.
Uh,
It was very people facing, got to do a lot of interaction with the C-suite stakeholders and people who were decision makers and like help them figure out what it was that they needed, what they were actually trying to achieve, how they were going to do that, and what they needed in their space that was going to support all of those goals. And then also worked with their employees to actually get them on board, right? And go from a really like old legacy building they'd been for 50 years, family owned company, really great culture, and make sure that those positive aspects were carried over into this new space and frankly, a new way of working. And that was kind of it for me. After that project, I was like, I'm doing this full time. This is like solving people problems, making design recommendations, but really thinking about it from like the highest possible level, right? If you're not having a purpose, if you don't know what it is that you're trying to achieve in a space, does the rest even really matter? That's
yeah.
like my hot take.
Well, I mean, help me kind of understand like the framework as to how you think about this. So workplace is a broad subject. If we were to like double click into this, I have to imagine that the folks you're working with are asking some semblance of all the similar questions. How do you kind of break it up, right? There's like there's the hard stuff, right? The walls, doors, windows, etc. There's the cultural stuff. Like, what's the framework? How do you enter into a project asking the right questions?
That is, I feel like that's my sweet spot, honestly. And it's a thing that I think designers can often struggle with, right? Like we're not always taught to ask questions, but we should. It just makes the design even stronger. So when I go in with a client, I really try to understand a couple of things, right? Like who are they? How do they see themselves? Is there an appetite for change or even a goal for change where they might be in one phase of their business or they might be changing leadership or there might be something that is causing or affecting or asking for a particular kind of change. And I want to know what that is from their point of view. And then I want to know what else they've tried, right? Especially now, like as people are really struggling to figure out what work looks like because there isn't a standard anymore, right? There's like a couple of different flavors. All of those get implemented in different ways and enforced in different ways. So it's good to know what people have tried. So I always ask them, like, if you're looking to go hybrid, have you already tried being remote? Have you already tried this in different kinds of ways? What has worked of that? What didn't work? Didn't meet your expectations? Did you find out that you were coming up short in something? And try to sort of take those lessons learned. And then I try to gauge people's appetite for experimenting with different things. One of the things that is probably surprisingly challenging is getting people on board with some of these ideas, even when they're hiring you to do it, right? Like you hired me because you wanted to make a change, but it doesn't seem like you or your people are that ready for it. Pilots are actually incredibly helpful. So, figuring out what you do need to pilot, what should be tested, how to do that in a way that is effective, probably like, needs to be done economically, needs to be done within a certain time frame, needs to be measured for some kind of feedback, doing all of those things and then making sure that, okay, this pilot is building confidence and consensus and getting everybody behind this thing that they're ready to either invest a lot in or, tag on to a big amount of change for. It's kind of the best thing that you can do. And not that many people do it. So kind of figuring out if like that is their right, if there's an appetite for that or like how we could achieve that tends to be really successful, but you have to ask it. Almost nobody comes up to me and says like, what I really want to do is a pilot. That doesn't tend to happen.
Right. Right, right. Well, so I want to paint a scenario. I'm a CEO of a fledgling company. We're growing. We have folks across different places around the US. We just raised a little bit of capital and we think we're going to be growing. We are remote considering what our next chapter is. I don't know if it's typically a CEO or if it's some like
Oh
COO or
yeah.
but like folks that
C-suite
you're working
folks.
with. But how do I even enter into this conversation? Like what questions should I be asking? What are like common challenges that folks at this stage? And I don't know, just to pose a scenario, we have currently 100 folks and we think we're going to be going to 200 folks in the next 24 months.
Yeah, I would say curiosity is absolutely the right place to be. Like, you don't want to be asking questions after you've implemented all of this stuff and be like, oh, what do we do now? So it's the right time to ask. And then I'd probably ask you a lot of questions about a couple of different kind of buckets, right, of business. I'd ask you about your business goals and what it is that you want to achieve, right? At a very high level, you said you want to grow, you're looking to expand pretty quickly. I would ask if remote work is working for you, if there are any pain points there, especially around culture, connectivity, collaboration, talent retention, which can be a little bit tricky, right? Like if you don't have a very good culture or a culture of good onboarding or making people feel like they belong, you might be struggling with retention or a particular kind of engagement. And if that's not something you've already assessed, I can help you do that, right? I can help you assess your employee engagement and where connections are or aren't happening. There's a lot of great research coming out now around the power of relationships and collaboration, whether they're in person or virtual, and how the two are different. That is very much worth exploring. And then I would ask you questions about your policy, right? Like, what are your policies in general for onboarding, for HR, for talent asking for raises? Like, what is your review, your performance review or talent review look like? Are there opportunities for some improvements there to meet some of your goals? I would also ask if you've ever considered or have done in-person retreats, right? Again, if culture is a thing that we're trying to sort of help flesh out or define a little bit more. A lot of companies that are remote are investing in in-person retreats to help cement some of those things and make things that are just virtual more real, right? Especially the people to people aspect. Those are very much worth investing in. And there's a lot of like cool examples coming out. And then I would ask you about technology and if there's how technology is sort of supporting, right? For lack of space, technology is the thing that makes your work happen. And I would ask you a lot of questions about what kind of systems you're using, if they're the right ones, if you've tried different kind of virtual collaboration tools, how you're prompting people to communicate and connect with each other, because that's really like without people, you've got a software, right? But a business is people. It's people that you've hired, people that work for you, people who are creating things, who are working with each other. So a lot of it is asking questions about people.
Yeah. Help me reconcile what I think to be a divide. So on the one hand, I see like this wave of executives like really making a push for like come back to work, come back to work. Like I'm sure you saw kind of the recent like Jamie Dimon rant where he was like just someone recorded it and just like people gotta stop being lazy. I don't know. There's this kind of vibe in the executive circles of like people just need to stop being wussies and get back to work kind of. And then I hear another crowd talking about like, well, we're coming back to work. I actually find it just much more productive being at home because there's less distraction. And like when I am at work, I'm getting tapped. And there's like kind of this disconnect between like what I'm hearing from executive circles versus like what's actually happening. How do I interpret that? Like what's the like disconnect here?
This is like my tagline whenever I talk to anybody and they're like, well, what's this person doing? Why are they doing that? My thing is, it doesn't matter what other people are doing. Every company has its own set of variables that they're trying to work with to achieve their own goals. Remote work, hybrid work, in-person work is just another variable in there, right? So, my personal take on what all of these, CEO hardline mandates are is not great. right? Like very rarely does it come from a place of like data-backed insights, right? They're not doing this because productivity was low. Usually these companies have been more profitable than they've ever been while people have been remote and hybrid. So that's not really working in their favor. Usually they are trying to align themselves with other people or come down hard on stuff. And the reality is there's a bunch of different realities, right? One is that hybrid work works for a lot of people, and there are a lot of ways to implement it. You don't have to be all remote or all in person for things to work. Being hybrid requires space and it requires people to be in at least one place, right? Like you either have to have people centered around a place that they can go to, or you need to have multiple people centered around multiple places where they are going to in person. Implementing hybrid programs is really hard. It is really, really hard. And it is not unusual for those programs to fail their targets, right? So if you've got a hybrid program where you're asking people to come back 4 days a week, I will bet good cold hard cash that most of those groups are only seeing people coming in 2 or 3 days a week on average. There's a new stat out there that says like the number of days that people are coming into the office in the US is increasing from like 2.3 to 2.5.
Mm,
Okay.
mm.
So yes, it is increasing, but it's not the numbers that we think they are. And often now, like because those programs are so hard to implement and they're so hard to get people back, people are aiming, right? Like they're aiming for 4 days in the hopes that they get three or five in the hopes that they get four. Whenever, and again, these are just data and facts. Whenever those programs get rolled out, there's a huge backlash for talent. You're going to lose your top players who appreciate flexibility almost more than anybody else, who expect trust because they're high performers, and who have options to work other places. Is that really worth it? Like maybe if you're Chase and Amazon, you can pull that off, but like most people can't wing that. They'd be in deep trouble if that happened.
Right, right. And tell me more, like what are other insights that you've garnered here? I know you've ran hundreds, thousands of surveys. What are other things that are not as intuitive that folks wouldn't expect that you've maybe learned?
I think companies really vary more from each other than we probably think. Like, culture is this underlying factor that affects how places work and makes it really hard to compare one company to another. Because culture isn't like how often we go for coffee or how many days a week we have pizza parties. Culture is how you do your work, right? Like, how do people communicate with each other and collaborate and feel like they're a part of something and are aligned in their mission in a way that, like, frankly, compensation just can't do for you? And that's really hard to compare between companies. Some people don't have it well defined, some people really do. And it can be influenced by industries, but often the thing that surveys show is that companies are much more different from each other. So it's important to look at yourself individually, right, as a company and understand what it is that you are trying to do, where you are today, and what you're ready for. If you're trying to get somebody who isn't Amazon to act like Amazon, you're going to set up for failure, right? You're not going to achieve those goals, not by turning a switch anyway.
Right. Right. What put maybe my architect hat on. What in the physical environment do you think is changing? So maybe to state the obvious, I imagine that the way an office is laid out as compared to say your super traditional like trading room floor is evolving, but what are you seeing? How is it evolving?
Yeah, I think overall, like, macro trends is real estate is more expensive. And because so many people tried and were able to make remote work happen, they see savings in real estate as a cost, as a viable option, right? Just because it's gotten so expensive, which is fine. So I think efficiency, right? Like there's this general aim for efficiency that isn't false, but they're not downsizing to the office of like yesteryear. The offices that we see today, or at least the good ones, are really purpose driven. So how space is allocated inside of an office can be really, really different. And that's great, right? It should be specific to whatever mission you're trying to accomplish. So I'd say more than ever, like the standard does not exist. An office could be anything. It could be a coffee shop with your company brand on it. It could be a trading floor. It depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So I think there's a lot more room to be a little bit playful and a little bit more creative with like, what is the office, right? Are people actually coming in to sit at their desk all day? Because if they're not, we probably shouldn't put a bunch of desks in there, right? You should put something else. If the goal of your office is to channel your culture, right? Or somehow make relationships more possible. That's something that clients talk to me about all the time. Like we want people to meet with each other. We want different departments to cross collaborate or at least like build relationships. Sometimes people who have worked at the same companies for 15 years have never met anybody outside their department. That's a problem, right? They've just always been on different floors and there isn't a central communal space for them to go. So when you're looking at a new office, you build that in. You build in that experience of, well, we're not going to put a cafe on every floor. We're going to put coffee points and we're going to put them in places where people have to stand up and walk and take the time to do those things. And we're going to put a really beautiful, like gorgeous, well-appointed, well-staffed, activated cafe on a central floor where everybody can go to. And that's going to sort of it forces the moment to happen in
Right.
many ways. So I think there's more of that real intentionality in the discussions that I think makes those kinds of spaces successful. If you're like strictly talking about design, like materiality and like what you see, I think there is again, a lot more option, right? You don't have to have an office look one kind of way. It's a great opportunity to reflect your brand values, who your employees are, who you want them to be, and tell them what they're on board to be a part of. So a Spotify office should not look like a law firm, right? That's not their culture. That's not their business. And that's been true for a while, but I think the range of how far you can kind of pull that rubber band is getting even longer, which is really fun, right? You get some really interesting things. And even from like a landlord side, when you're renovating a building to attract a certain kind of tenant, right now, I would say the sky is kind of the limit. You see all kinds of like weird and fun amenities in buildings for people to be a part of. I read something the other day about an office building in Dallas, taking a whole floor that had been vacant for a while and they turned it into a pickleball floor indoors in a skyscraper. Had like a kind of cafe area next to it and then just like a couple of pickleball courts in this tower. Cool. That's really cool.
I mean, I guess by any means to draw folks back, but on I mean on that note, so you have had a chance to work with some incredibly cool tech companies, media companies, banks. I'm curious, does something stand out as perhaps the most rewarding or even challenging thing that really kind of changed your perspective on the workplace?
I think the most challenging thing right now, I mean, at least when I worked with HSBC, the most challenging thing was having people predict what was going to happen, right? Like we were asking in 2021 questions about what was going to be going on in 2023. And there was so much change in like how people were working and what was allowed and not allowed at that time that it was a challenging question. So I think some of that prediction is still can still be difficult for clients to say. So you kind of have to get creative about the information that you're using for planning, right? Like if somebody says that they're going to be a certain size or they're going to be very hybrid, right? They're going to be like 2 or 3 days a week. Okay, well, that's a certain number of desks per week, right? Like not more than 50 or 60%. And then in a year's time, while you're doing the construction, they tell you, oh, actually, we're going to move to like 4 or 5 days a week. That's like a 25% change in how much space you need, which is a problem, right? When we don't have the seats to accommodate that. So I think that's one of the most challenging things is future casting accordingly. And maybe that's just part of growing pains of like figuring out how to plan for hybrid as well. Like maybe it can't be as efficient without a really good policy. You know, if you're not ready to commit to a real limit on capacity, for example, maybe you're not ready to go hybrid and you're not going to be able to save as much space, right? You can't achieve those things without really good policy. And that's something business has to be prepared for. If you're not, then be more flexible, right? Like you have to accept that in lieu of flexibility, you're going to get savings or the other way around. So I think that's a really challenging thing. The most rewarding thing for me is always being on that people side, often working with employees like they don't get asked what they're doing, right? From like a real corporate level, they're not asked like, well, how is your day to day and what does work for you and what do you wish was better? Like what would make a difference in your ability to get like your best work done? And once you get people kind of going with that, they all have stories. Like everybody has something to say about it. Everybody does have an opinion and a point of view. And when you look at all those things together, it's really rewarding to paint a picture and like tell leadership what their folks are doing and be able to represent them in that way. And then when you actually take them into the space, people tend to be very skeptical about all these conversations. They're like, great, another survey or somebody else asking me a thing that I'm never going to get. And then you take them into the space and it's beautiful and large and it has all of these cool little details that they couldn't even imagine, but that are a reflection of the things they told you. And people light up. They genuinely light up and they're like, oh, this is so cool. I can't wait to be here. And that is such a rewarding moment. And it usually takes like the better part of a year, like many, many months to make that come true. But it's the best. That's the best part of my job is taking people on tours of like pre-built space that they're like not quite ready to move into. There's a couple months left and they're just like, oh my God, I can't wait to get in here. This is going to be awesome. It's great.
I think, I mean, in that spirit, you talked about how owners are getting creative with changing a complete floor to pickleball or whatever it might be. Question is, like how, I guess, like how does this play out? So for example, like we're often having conversations like very binary, like it's a corporate office or like you're working at home. But what we're starting to introduce is like all of these other use cases, like a pickleball, which is not, wouldn't even say it's actually work. So like how, I ask myself, I walk around like Midtown Manhattan, like where I'm at, and I see a lot of corporate office buildings super empty. I mean, of course, you have the Class A buildings that are, the big companies there, but like for the most part, like there's like it's a little scary, like how empty some of these floors are in New York City. I trust, every city's kind of slightly different vibe, but ask myself, well, what else can be done there that's not an office that could be productive and like what the public wants? Have you seen any creative use cases from owners that whether it's pickleball or just like fundamentally some type of other use that you're starting to see it's less of like office, 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 and more just like kind of more creative
Yeah,
uses?
I think it's a great case for mixed use developments, right? Like even tenants that are looking for class A or above space aren't just looking for office. They're usually looking for an office that is well situated and well appointed and has a lot of these conveniences and experience around it. That is part of what they're buying into. Some of that can be just about activations. And I've seen a lot of landlords invest in improvements that aren't just about look and feel, right? Like they're not renovating their lobbies to just be the most beautiful thing you've ever seen, but also to have some function, to be a lot of like the third space where people are getting their work done that is could be like an airport lounge or a coffee bar or not their home but not quite the office. That is actually a really valuable experience for people, and so much of it comes back to that is just experience, right? Whatever that means. I think that's the best one. Things like pickleball courts are really cool. Yes, there's like pickleball courts, the golf simulators are really popular for some industries, right? And that's fine. Like what it is not actually just a pickleball court or a golf simulator. It's a time for people to have an experience that is fun, which seems like a really silly thing to say, but can you sell fun? Yeah, you can sell fun.
Yeah.
And I think
It,
that's what a
it's
lot of those things are,
It's super
right?
interesting that you're even framing it this way, because in like my I guess super traditional CEO mindset, I'm like, if people are not behind a screen like doing something, then they're not being productive. And that's obviously not just that's just not how life is, right? Like sometimes work is being done on the pickleball or on a golf simulator or like over coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Like if your
Uh,
work is relationship based and it's really like, I need people to trust me to buy the product I'm selling or to invest all this money with me, they're not going to do that if you're just sitting behind a screen all day. Like, yes, you have to be good at your job, but that's not the only way that work gets done. And that's not how work used to get done either, which is part of the perplexing thing that I find about these like CEOs and their 5 day mandates if you're not in the office. Like, do you think these people were sitting behind a desk 40 hours a week and that's how they got to be CEO? Because I doubt it. I
right,
don't think so.
right, right, right. I can't help but to think it is coming from some place of like anxiety that perhaps they're like taking it out on the fact that they can't see their people.
Yeah, which makes sense. I wrote something a couple of weeks ago about, managers not getting enough training. I always feel so bad for managers when they have to go through these mandates one way or the other, right? Like whether you're going remote or you're going back to being in person 5 days a week. Like, at the end of the day, managers always get caught holding the like crappy end of the stick because it's their job to actually implement it, usually to like track where their people are and to give them messages when they're not doing things a certain way or following the mandate. And that just seems really bad. That seems like a bad place to be. Those people are the ones who are moving your business along. hopefully, right? Good managers. Do you want them to be managing people? Like you want to give them another job, even though it's not actually affecting their bottom line? I don't know. Careful consideration. A lot of folks like don't, or you see very rarely like managers getting the kind of training they need to implement those changes. Like I was saying before, hybrid work is really hard to implement because it's just a lot of change. It's a lot more coordination to get it right. Usually involves technology and making sure that that's aligned with whatever you're trying to do. Like a manager doesn't need another system to like be responsible for, or like another thing that they have to think of when they're trying to arrange their 60th meeting that week. So train them, help them
Right.
out, let them tell you what is really bad and like keeping them from doing their work well, and then train accordingly, provide the resources and the tools. And it just seems so obvious. If you thought of space as a product and the managers or employees were your end users, you would fix the product. So why wouldn't you do the same thing with your workplace experience?
On that note, it would not be a technology centric podcast if I didn't ask you about technology and AI, but I'm curious, maybe even five, if you kind of rewind 5, 10 years, perhaps we're using different tools, but what are the tools, software that folks are using that we just simply cannot live without right now in
I
terms of like how to communicate, etc.?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of like kind of obvious ones that end up having a really big impact on people. You know, whatever tools people are using to communicate with each other, whether you're in person or remote, matters. Like, hopefully, people are using something other than just email to communicate with each other, right? And you'd think that that would be the case, but it's not always. Communication tools really matter. And I think in a world where we are distributed and busy and everybody's multitasking all the time, like the toll of meetings is so high, right? Like people are just exhausted. Managers are in back-to-back meetings for 40 hours of the week, so they have to work after hours just to do something. Async communications is something that you'll find like a lot of people like me get on their little soapbox about because it's just that's the future. Right. If you are not using async comms to work with other people in the time where the receiver needs it, you're wasting time, frankly, right? And there are so many like cool new collaboration tools like that that you can use. I'm a big fan of like using online whiteboard spaces like Miro. I will preach all day about Miro. Things like that allow you to collaborate with people in real time, to leave communication and like messaging and comments on things that you need whenever the person is ready to read them, to track things real time. All of that affects how people work. And like I was saying before, how people work is your culture. So the technology should support that. If you're talking about space, I think there's it's like an opportunity that's happening in real time for technology to help read what a space is actually doing, but that's only useful if you're going to do something about it. So things like measuring occupancy and attendance are great if you're going to do something with that information. And there are some systems out there that get really detailed data that's not just about whether a room is in use or not, but that will tell you how many people are in the room, if they're doing collaborative work with each other, or if they're collaborating in a hybrid way with a screen and somebody else is dialing in, if their posture indicates whether they are working with somebody else or just meeting with them, that can help inform like what kind of furniture do you need to support that? Where should the screen be located in the room for the best kind of collaboration? There's tools that can help the end users pick their day. So in one of the projects I worked on, we asked the architects to embed sensors that would tell you what the real-time lighting, noise, and temperature situation was all over the floors. And then there were screens outside of the elevators that any end user could go and check, like, I really need to go somewhere that's quiet, or I'm freezing today and I want to go somewhere that's colder. And then you could go up to the screen, sort of press a couple of filters and pick a space based on that variable, which is super cool, right? Like that's a very human place for technology to meet you. And sometimes those are the things that end up making you more or less productive or are going to give you the best work experience. But it's really hard to do that without data.
Yeah. Ask differently. So we're often asked like to predict 5, 10 years into futures, like what space is going to look like. But I want to ask you the question kind of in a different way, especially amidst all of the different software and technology that is changing what seems like to be every day. What do you think in 10 years is likely not going to change? Like about our spaces and about the ways that we work. What's likely going to be the same?
I think spaces are always going to matter, right? It doesn't matter how hybrid or how remote people are. Space matters. Quality of space matters. I'm going to say that meeting other humans in person matters. Maybe it's not crucial for every single thing, but I do think that it matters. Loneliness is a real epidemic. I was very lucky when I started working, even though I was 5 days a week and not at all flexible. Like I used to have to take time off to go to a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day, which seems unfathomable right now. I made a lot of really good friends at work in a city where I didn't really know other people and didn't have other adult friends. So it was a gateway into my lifestyle. And if you don't have that because it's not coming from the office, then you have to go get it somewhere else, hopefully. Right. And at least from what I'm seeing around there, that's pretty hard to do. So I think, it may seem silly, like, oh, I need to go to the office to make friends or like to meet people, but that's just like some of that is just behavioral science. Like, you meet people at school, you meet them at university, you meet them at clubs and at sports that you go to. Like, all of that is organized activity that happens in a space. Work is a big part of that when you're an adult. And I do think that the spaces where people do that matter, right? Like, yes, you want a beautiful space that is going to improve your quality of life day to day at the office. That's going to help you connect with other people. That's going to help you feel like you have a mission and a sense of purpose, or at least that whatever you're doing day to day is putting you on that path. Maybe it's not the thing, but it's helping you be on that path in some way or another. And I believe in that. I mean, you know as well as I do that quality of environment matters. And any architect, any good architect that you ask about that will say the same. A home will always be a home, but we're humans that live beyond just the house. So public spaces matter. Your commute to work matters. The office that you're getting to at the end matters. So I think that part will not change. At least, being on the real estate side, I think there's always like a low level panic that like commercial real estate is going to die. And I just don't think that that's true. I don't think that that's going to go away. It might change, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I do think that like the type of space will change. And, like we were saying earlier, I think mixed use spaces will be more common, hopefully. And maybe that will bring something like the 20-minute city into reality. Maybe they'll be even smaller, right? Like, what's a 5-minute city just in your office building or in your office, your suburban office building and the like 2-minute walking distance around it. Hopefully, yes, that will change and it will bring a lot more things together so that you don't have all these like deserts of experience.
Uh-huh.
You know, we
Yeah.
need more like positive human experience, not less.
Karina, this has been incredibly fun, and I think your thoughtful takes is something that kind of opens up. It turns out that as humans, we need to interact with each other, and like to think that that's a hot take is actually kind of crazy these days, but really, really thoughtful. For folks that maybe listened, in how did they reach you? How did they work with you? Where should they go find you?
Yeah, I am always available on LinkedIn. I love meeting people online. I'm also on the scene, so if you're in a workplace place or a conference or something, I'm probably there too. I'm at Stream Realty Partners where I do all of this stuff day to day for workplace, but you can always find me online.